Feel the high-voltage energy of a story that refused to be silenced by the passing of time. We bring you the electric reality of life's most intense confrontations, wrapped in a cinematic glow that never fades. Hit that subscribe button now and power up your imagination with us.
I did not move when my brother walked into that boardroom. I did not look up from my hands folded on the table. I had learned a long time ago that stillness unnerves people who expect you to collapse. He expected me to collapse. My name is Claire Whitfield. I am 31 years old, and for the last 4 years, my brother had been telling anyone who would listen that I was the reason our family company was falling apart. He was wrong about almost everything, but he had no idea how wrong he was about to find out he was. Let me take you back to where this started. Our father built Whitfield Logistics from nothing. 40 years of hauling freight across the Midwest, building routes, losing sleep, shaking hands with people who doubted him. By the time I was born, the company had 40 trucks and a small warehouse outside of Columbus, Ohio. By the time I was in high school, it had 3 regional hubs and a name that people in the industry recognized. My brother Marcus is 6 years older than me. He came into the company the way older sons sometimes do, not because he was the most qualified, but because he was the first one there and no one thought to question it. My father loved him. I loved him too, once. He could be generous when things were going well. He had a way of making you feel included when the room was full and the numbers were good. But Marcus had a flaw that our father never wanted to see clearly. He believed that loyalty meant silence. He believed that family meant protection from consequences. And he believed that I, the younger sister who went away to college, who studied finance and then disappeared into a government job in Washington, was an outsider who had forfeited her seat at the table. When our father had his first stroke 3 years ago, everything changed. Father survived, but his speech was slower after that and his right hand trembled when he held a pen. He asked Marcus to take over day-to-day operations. Marcus agreed immediately, with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly that moment his entire adult life. I drove back to Columbus that weekend. I sat at the kitchen table with my father, while he drank his tea and looked out the window at the backyard he had mowed every Saturday for 30 years. "I need you to keep an eye on things," he told me. His voice was quieter than I remembered, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, tired, honest. Marcus means well. But he gets in over his head and he doesn't always tell me. I told my father I would. I meant it. What I did not tell him, what I had not told anyone in my family, was what I actually did for a living. My title, officially, was Senior Financial Analyst at a mid-level consulting firm in Washington, D.C. That was what my LinkedIn said. That was what I told my mother's friends at Christmas. That was the cover I had maintained for 4 years with the kind of discipline that becomes second nature after a while. The truth was that I worked for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, a division of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. My actual job was investigating money laundering, fraud, and financial crimes with interstate implications. I had spent 4 years building cases against people who believed they were untouchable. I had learned to read financial statements the way other people read faces. Every number told a story, and most of the time, the story being hidden was the most important one. When I started reviewing Whitfield Logistics after my father's stroke, I was not looking for anything. I was just keeping the promise I had made at the kitchen table. Within 6 weeks, I found something I did not want to find. The company's freight billing system had been modified, not dramatically, not in a way that would trigger an automatic audit flag. But if you knew what to look for, if you had spent 4 years looking at exactly this kind of adjustment in exactly this kind of business, you could see it. Certain routes were being billed to shell vendor accounts that did not correspond to any registered carrier in the federal database. The amounts were not enormous, between $8,000 and $20,000 per transaction. But they were consistent, and they had been running for 14 months. Someone was using Whitfield Logistics to move money. I did not confront Marcus. I knew better than to do that. Instead, I did what I had been trained to do. I documented everything. I built a file. I preserved the records. And then, because the transactions crossed state lines and involved amounts that met the federal threshold, I filed a confidential referral through the appropriate channels at my agency. I told no one in my family. I told no one at all. 3 months later, Marcus found out that someone had been pulling financial records from the company's accounting system using credentials tied to my remote access login. Credentials I had been given by my father to keep an eye on things. Marcus drew his own conclusion. He drew it fast, and he drew it loudly, and he drew it in front of our father. He said I was stealing from the company. He said I had been accessing confidential records without authorization, that I had been diverting funds through manipulated billing entries, and that the evidence pointed directly at me. He said I had always resented him for being given leadership of the company. He said I had come back to Columbus not out of loyalty to our father, but out of jealousy, and that I had decided to take what I believed I was owed. My father looked at me across the table with those same sharp, tired eyes. He did not ask me if it was true. I think part of him wanted me to simply deny it with enough force that he could believe me without having to look at the evidence. I did not deny it with force. I said quietly that he should let the process play out. Marcus took that as confirmation. He went to the company's board of directors, 4 members, 2 of whom were longtime family friends, 1 of whom was his college roommate, and 1 of whom was an outside appointee from a regional bank that held a line of credit against the business. He presented his case. He showed the access logs. He showed the billing discrepancies. He proposed that I be formally removed from any advisory role with the company and that the matter be referred to a private arbitration hearing before a mutually agreed-upon panel. My father, still recovering, still trusting the son who had been present while I was away, signed the authorization. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus. I remember the elevator ride up. I remember how the city looked gray through the lobby windows and how the woman at the front desk gave me the polite, careful smile that people give to someone they have been told is in trouble. I remember thinking that I'd spent 4 years learning to read rooms and that this room was going to be the hardest one I had ever walked into. My brother was already seated when I arrived. He had brought his attorney, a man named Douglas Pratt, who had handled commercial litigation in Columbus for 20 years and who had a reputation for being methodical and unsparing. He had also brought the company's CFO, a man named Gerald Sutton, who had been with Whitfield Logistics for 12 years and who, I had recently confirmed, was the second person whose credentials had been used to access the modified billing system. I had brought my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who specialized in federal regulatory matters and who had flown in from Washington the night before. The arbitration panel consisted of 3 members. The chair was a retired judge named Howard Calloway, who had spent 22 years on the federal bench in the Southern District of Ohio before retiring to private practice in dispute resolution. I recognized his name the moment I saw it on the panel confirmation letter. I did not say anything to Patricia about it. I simply told her we would be fine, and she gave me the look that attorneys give clients who seem unreasonably calm. The hearing opened the way these things do, with procedural statements, introductions, an overview of the claims. Douglas Pratt stood and laid out Marcus's case in the measured, confident tone of a man who believes he is holding all the cards. He walked the panel through the access logs. He walked them through the billing discrepancies. He noted that the remote access credentials used to query the flagged accounts had been assigned specifically to me, that the queries had occurred during off hours, and that the pattern of activity was consistent with someone covering tracks rather than conducting legitimate oversight. He paused at one point and looked directly at me. Ms. Whitfield has described her role in this company as that of an advisor acting on behalf of her father, he said. We would ask the panel to consider whether a genuine advisor, acting in good faith, would conduct her review in the middle of the night, using queries specifically designed to avoid triggering the company's internal audit alerts. I kept my hands folded on the table. My father sat against the wall to my left, slightly behind me. He had insisted on being present. I had not tried to talk him out of it. I wanted him in that room. Douglas Pratt was not finished. He called Gerald Sutton as a supporting witness. Sutton walked through the technical details of the billing system modification with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed his testimony more than once. He explained how the shell vendor accounts had been created. He explained how funds had been redirected. He pointed to a chart on the screen showing the timeline of transactions alongside the timeline of my remote access sessions and made sure the panel understood that the overlap was not coincidental. Then Pratt turned back to me. Miss Gasher, Whitfield, he said. You've told your family that you work for a consulting firm in Washington. Can you provide this panel with a single piece of documentation confirming that employment? A pay stub, a contract, a tax filing. Anything at all that verifies you are who you say you are and that your presence in this company's financial system was legitimate? The room was very quiet. I looked at Patricia. She placed her hands flat on the table and said calmly that the defense would present its response in full. Pratt smiled. It was the smile of someone who had asked a question he already knew the answer to. Because, he continued, what we have found is that the consulting firm listed on Ms. Min's Whitfield's professional profile does not appear to have filed payroll records consistent with her listed compensation for the past 4 years, which raises a rather significant question about what, exactly, she has been doing in Washington and why she was so interested in this company's financial records. He let that sit. I heard my father shift in his chair behind me. Marcus was looking at me from across the table. I had known that look my whole life. It was the look he gave me when we were children and he had told our parents something I had done wrong before I had the chance to explain it myself. Satisfaction with a thin layer of regret on top, just enough to seem like it cost him something. She's always been the ghost, Marcus said, quietly, as if to himself, just loudly enough for the room to hear. None of us ever really knew what she did out there. And I think that tells you everything you what she did out there. And I think that tells you everything. I let him finish. Then I looked at Patricia, and I gave her the nod we had discussed. Patricia reached into the leather portfolio beside her and removed a sealed envelope. The paper was heavy. The seal on the front bore a mark that I will not describe in detail, but which any federal official in that room would recognize immediately. She stood, walked to the panel table, and placed it in front of Howard Calloway. This document, she said, has been authorized for review by the panel chair only under the provisions applicable to proceedings involving personnel with active federal designation. We ask that Judge Calloway review it privately before the panel continues. Pratt was on his feet immediately. I object to the introduction of any sealed material that has not been disclosed in pre-hearing filings. The authorization covers the non-disclosure, Patricia said, without raising her voice. Judge Calloway will understand the basis when he reads it. Howard Calloway had not moved. He was looking at the envelope with the expression of a man who had handled enough federal proceedings to recognize exactly what kind of document arrived in that kind of seal. He picked it up. He turned it over once. He looked at me across the room with an expression I cannot fully describe. Recognition, recalibration, something that might have been close to respect. We'll take a 10-minute recess, he said. He carried the envelope with him when he left the room. I kept my eyes on the table during the recess. I could feel Marcus watching me. I could feel Gerald Sutton watching me too, though his attention had a different quality now. The edgy, careful attention of someone who is starting to recalculate. Pratt spent the recess leaning toward Marcus and speaking in a low voice. Whatever he was saying, Marcus was nodding. He was still confident. He had the access logs. He had the billing records. He had the CFO. He had the timeline. What could 10 minutes change? Judge Calloway came back into the room alone. He set the envelope on the table in front of him. He put on his reading glasses, then took them off again. He looked at Pratt. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Gerald Sutton in a way that made Sutton look down at his hands. Then he looked at me. Ms. Whitfield, he said. I apologize for the nature of this proceeding. I heard my father make a sound behind me, not a word. Just a breath that meant he was starting to understand that something was different than what he had been told. Judge Calloway addressed the panel. I've reviewed the sealed documentation provided by Ms. Whitfield's counsel. I am not at liberty to disclose the contents in full in this setting. What I can tell you is that Ms. Whitfield's professional activities for the past 4 years have been conducted in an official federal capacity, and that those activities are directly relevant to the financial records she accessed within this company. Pratt stood again. With respect, that's an extraordinary claim without. Mr. Pratt. Calloway's voice did not rise. It simply stopped Pratt, the way a closed door stops someone walking. I spent 22 years on the federal bench. I have held a security clearance continuously for 19 of those years. I know what I'm reading. Please sit down. Pratt sat down. Calloway continued. The billing irregularities identified in the company's system were not created by Ms. Whitfield. They were identified by her, documented by her, and reported through the appropriate federal channels 14 months ago. The remote access sessions, logged under her credentials, were conducted as part of a sanctioned investigative review. The shell vendor accounts at the center of this dispute are currently the subject of an active federal inquiry. He let that last sentence land. I watched it land on Marcus like something physical. The confidence in his face didn't disappear all at once. It dissolved, layer by layer, starting with the certainty and ending with the expression of a man who is going back through every decision he has made in the last 6 months, and understanding, in sequence, how each one has made things worse. I watched it land on Gerald Sutton differently. Sutton had gone the color of old paper. His hands, which had been resting on the table, were no longer visible. Furthermore, Calloway said, given the nature of the documentation I've reviewed, I am obligated to note for the record that this panel lacks jurisdiction to adjudicate matters intersecting with an active federal investigation. This hearing is concluded. He closed the folder in front of him. However, he added, and the word fell into the silence of the room like a stone into still water, I would strongly encourage legal counsel for the claimant to advise their client to seek independent legal guidance before close of business today. Douglas Pratt was already gathering his papers. His movements were efficient and careful, the movements of a professional who has just realized the ground has changed and is prioritizing his own footing. Marcus had not moved. I stood. I straightened my jacket. I picked up my folder from the table. My father was standing now too. He had both hands pressed against the back of his chair as if he needed it to keep him steady. When I turned to face him, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him look. Not in a diminished way, in the way of a man who has just understood the full weight of something he did not see clearly. Claire, he said. I walked to him. I put my hand over his hand where it gripped the chair. You asked me to keep an eye on things, I said. I kept an eye on things. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. I didn't know, he said. I didn't know what you were doing out there. All those years. I know what you thought, I said. It's okay? It was not entirely okay. I want to be honest about that. There is a particular kind of loneliness in protecting people who do not know you are protecting them, in carrying a version of yourself that you cannot show to the people you love most. I had grown used to it. That did not mean it cost nothing. But I had not done this to be seen. I had done it because my father asked me to look after something that mattered to him, and because I found something that needed to be looked after. Marcus left the room without speaking to me. I did not try to stop him. He had lawyers to call and decisions to make, and whatever came next for him was no longer something I could manage. I had handed it to the process, and the process would do what it did. Gerald Sutton left, 2 steps behind Marcus, walking quickly, his eyes on the floor. Patricia found me in the hallway outside the conference room and allowed herself a small, satisfied exhale. That went the way it needed to go, she said. Yes, I said. Calloway's a good man, she said. I've appeared before him twice. He doesn't miss things. No, I said. He doesn't. I took the elevator down alone. In the lobby, I stopped at the window and looked out at the gray Columbus morning. The street was ordinary. Taxis, a delivery truck, a woman pushing a stroller against the wind with the focused determination of someone who has somewhere to be. I thought about the first time I drove back from Washington after my father called me from the hospital. I had made that drive in 5 hours, through the night, through Indiana and into Ohio, with the radio off and the windows up and my mind already running through every question I did not yet have answers to. I had not imagined it would take 3 years. I had not imagined it would end in a conference room with a retired federal judge reading a sealed document while my brother sat across the table and understood, for the first time, that the sister he had dismissed as a ghost had been watching everything. My phone rang. It was my father. Come to the house, he said. His voice was thick. I'll make coffee. I told him I would be there in 20 minutes. Before I got in the car, I caught my reflection in the glass door of the building. I was wearing my good gray blazer and the small pin I kept on the lapel, a detail that most people did not notice and that the people who did notice understood immediately. I had worn it that day on purpose, not for the room, for myself, a reminder of what I built in the years when my family thought I was building nothing. I drove to my father's house. I sat at the kitchen table where this had all started, and I drank the coffee he made, and we talked for a long time about things that had nothing to do with the company, and some things that had everything to do with us. He apologized 3 times. The 3rd time I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm and told him to stop. You trusted the person who was there, I said. That's not a failure, that's just what happened. You were always there, he said. I just couldn't see it. I didn't have an answer for that. Sometimes the truest things don't need one. On the drive back to the hotel that evening, I passed the Whitfield Logistics dispatch hub on the east side of Columbus, the original one, the one my father had built from the second warehouse he ever owned. The lights were on inside. Trucks were moving in and out of the lot. 40 years of early mornings and kept promises, still running. I had not saved it for the recognition. I had saved it because it was worth saving, because my father had built something real and someone had been trying to quietly hollow it out from the inside, and I was the only person in a position to stop them. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes being the one who could and did is its own kind of answer. I pulled out of the parking lot and pointed the car toward the highway. I had a flight back to Washington in the morning. There was another file on my desk, another set of numbers that told a story no one was supposed to notice. Someone else's family, someone else's company, someone else's trust being quietly betrayed by someone who believed they were safe because no one was watching. They were wrong about that. Someone was always watching.